Uh, Thanks very much, Peter. Now, we're going to have some comments, questions answered from the audience, and then we'll have Michael respond. Okay, JP?
Thanks for that. Now I know who Michael Woolcock is of the article I've been using in my class. Has been The Fiction of Development. And this is one of those pieces that everybody has that favorite piece. I wish I'd written that. And so I'm so glad you wrote that. And now this paper, I'm sure, will become a part of my syllabus as well. You warned us not to think about cases where we go somewhere and say, oh, I've seen this before, but I couldn't help but do that as you were speaking. And I say this with slight provocation because the place where I've seen this before is Geneva. Okay? You have justice being provided from top in a way that authorities at the top like to provide it, and contestation from below. And then I was trying to think of where in those matrices would I fit in where some notion of new justice or old justice begins to arrive. And so here I'm trying to think with you rather than against you. And I thought, well, it would, for me, take putting two or three of your categories together. And also Peter Evans was evoking this. You're never really railing against a structure. I like to think of power configurations that you're railing against. And in those power configurations, in those interstitialities, you find spaces where some kind of problem solving might begin to take place, which doesn't look like the same old. It begins to look like something new. But the moment it begins to look like something new, the old ones come in and say, no, we don't like the new. Or you have to show them how they might like the new. Well, the good news is that over and over again, even in a place like Geneva, where the power differential might be a little more than the village headman and the peasant without any land. You might have a United States versus a Mali, and Mali is not even being allowed into the room. New things do happen, but they happen so incrementally. And they happen in a problem-solving space, but not without due deference to power. And it means that somewhere along the way, new meanings must arise out of a contestation, but their translation into new law still follows a similar old type of logic. So it's sort of, you're given a particular kind of social construction of reality, and then you build on top of that, but you don't deviate as much. But it's still emancipatory. So I wouldn't give up hopes just yet, because I think that this happens. It happens a lot in Geneva, where, and also the weak learn. And they don't often like to admit it, but there were countries who were in Geneva against services are not for us, but at the end said, oh, well, maybe there's something over here.
Thanks, Michael. I enjoyed the paper. I wanted to elaborate a bit on Peter Evans' point, and in a way a point that J.P. Singh just made also, which is I was interested in almost like a typology, and I don't know if this is friendly or not, but when do these different strategies of legal change, how do they articulate with authoritarianism versus democracy, equality versus inequality, civil society or its absence, ethnic divisions, that kind of thing. In some of the political economy stories of the rule of law, there's sort of a story about party contestation and balance. In some of the areas that I work in on social economic rights litigation, you sort of have litigation successes in high-quality democracies with elaborate constitutions, with open courts. And so I was just wondering whether it might be useful to sort of try and develop that a bit. And I wanted to get your initial thoughts on how these different six strategies fit into different settings.
Yeah, there's something wrong with it. Is it okay if I'm going to say a totally uncharacteristic thing, channeling a different part of Peter Evans, I think, which is, first of all, I loved your paper. I found it absolutely fascinating, and I loved the talk, which actually, at least in my brain, made it through a few cells that the paper didn't. But I'm wondering, and I guess I believe this human rights thing really is happening, and that justice cascades, those that you really are seeing a kind of ferment, and exactly what form it'll take where and how indigenous it'll be, I don't know, but it is happening. But I would love to raise the question of how it can be that these progressive things are happening kind of on the ground, and there's this ferment at a time when the global economy seems increasingly ruled by a kind of out of control capital that's not under anybody's effective political jurisdiction. And you seem to have these two movements of the sort of, I'll invoke Peter, and he's doing this paper with Bill Sewell on neoliberalism. And I don't usually like ultra-lefty arguments, and I'm not a paranoid type. I'm actually I love people friendly type. But I am moving in an increasingly anxiously paranoid direction myself. And so I'm trying to put together this kind of optimistic, crescent, there's a sense of ferment and things happening, with the extraordinary sense I have that the institutional capacity of the world to politically control those who are really shaping the lives of everyone is so.
Amen, sister. Nick? I'm scared.
Well, I wanted to first suggest a way, Michael, that you could get over your enthusiasm about the law. In December, the District of Columbia is having bar examinations to be licensed to practice. And I guarantee you, if you sit through a couple-day bar exam there or anywhere else, any notion that the law is a good thing or it advances anything will be thoroughly stamped out of your mind. And if that doesn't work, just spend some time at the District of Columbia Superior Court in room 114, and that'll get it. That's the arraignment court. I actually, although I am a lawyer and I've done what some people would call rule of law projects for more than 30 years, didn't like the paper. I didn't like it because, first of all, I thought, I've never done a rule of law project, although, as I say, people call what I do rule of law. I've done projects to reform the police in El Salvador. I've done projects to try to improve the way legislatures write laws, the way courts process domestic violence cases. But I've resisted the idea that that has anything to do with the rule of law. And whenever somebody rhetorically has tried to claim it, I've tried to strike it out of the document. I think rule of law is, of course, it's too subjective, it's too general, it just doesn't, it's too broad and a sort of goal for development practitioners to pursue. And I think not only is it therefore not a good thing for people who do projects to think about, I'd much rather think about how do I improve land rights for poor people in the peri-urban areas of Lima. I think also rule of law is not a fruitful lens from which to approach issues of development, because law itself is such a protean concept. I mean, you talked about the poor laws in Elizabethan England, and then you talk about bringing the ruler of England to account through a judicial process. Yes, law is involved in both things, but in radically different ways. In the question of the poor laws, what's interesting is why did the norm change? And then the details of the poor law itself are not very interesting except to legislative draftsmen. Whereas the question of how to bring a ruler to heel through a legal process is a much deeper question in which you are interested in much more legal things. So, I mean, I think that just the lens of law itself in your 6 categories, I thought, in fact, betrayed it, that they were sort of confusing and overlapping, to be candid. And that I think a much more fruitful way to look at it is how do we get policy change? And there are many different kinds of policy changes. Certainly there's no paradigmatic system for looking at it, but we can, for example, going back to Ted Lowy's work, think about whether the change produces concentrated or diffuse benefits, and whether the costs impose concentrated or diffuse costs on those who lose. And there are lots of ways, if you just use that simple little tool to see how policy changes and policy entrepreneurs. I say to people that, like yourself, who are dipping into the rule of law business, that law is really politics, and the question of policy change, they have the same roots. And that's just, to me, a much more fruitful way to look at what we're trying to do when we help foster policy changes that create welfare-enhancing equilibria in developing countries. So that's a rule of law practitioner's take.
Just a quick response from a political scientist. I know a lot of lawyers who say, oh, the law doesn't work, the law is terrible, et cetera, but policy change, politics, that's where it's at. Sort of, as a political scientist, I can say, it's not very good there either. So, and it's sort of also meaningless. And I do think that there, however, is a distinction to be made between law and politics. And that when people talk about the rule of law, and I'm no expert in it, I think they're not talking about what you were talking about lowy forms of political change, whether they're distributive or not. They're talking about some sort of regularities that the ordinary person can count on, in which a law that applies to A applies to B more or less, unless there are other reasons to be included, and that this is understood in many, many countries, not necessarily every single country, but certainly not just Western countries. So I just wanted to kind of say the sort of fantasy among lawyers that there's something going on more coherent on the other side of the street. It's not more coherent on the other side of the street.
Yes, please.
At the Institute for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason, where I teach and I'm a practitioner and scholar there, I'm very much interested, or I was very much interested in what you spoke about, the credibility of a third-party intervener. And I would love to hear more from you, given all the challenges about the cut-and-paste approach, about what do we do about the cultural competency and fluency of a third-party intervener, particularly when it deals with designing structures related to law.